Great to see you all around. This morning we're going to kick off a series in the book of Jonah. We're going to spend about 3 weeks sitting with what we find in there. It's something that I've been wanting to share for a little while, so I've been pottering around in it since last year. So hopefully you find and hear something useful out of that. If we don't, then that's my fault. We're in February now, so we're in that long, hot stretch of the year where we start to fire things up again and we start to settle into a rhythm of life. The tennis is nearly over. The kids are back at school. My goodness, that's great. The kids are back at school and they're getting into the routine of that. The footy's only like 3 weeks away and then footy's back as well. And start to settle into that rhythm of the great Australian dream of a quiet, controlled, comfortable suburban life. February is a time where we often settle into our grooves. But the thing is, grooves, if we leave them long enough, eventually become ruts. And ruts, if they go deep enough, become graves. Last year I said a couple of times that I thought it was time for us to be thinking a little bit more intentionally about discipleship as a community. And what I meant by that was, what does it mean for us to live as followers of Jesus here and now? What does it look like for us to carry that name of Jesus as we go through our life? There are a number of competing opinions about what that looks like for us. Should we be culture warriors going out and confronting everything that we see that's wrong with the world? Should we be doing the opposite and kind of crawling back into our own little holy huddles, building our own little ghettos, trying to separate ourselves out from the world? What does it look like for us to carry that name of Jesus wherever we find ourselves? How do we live in a world that bears witness to who Jesus is, that carries his light and his salt and is light-bringing and life-giving? You know, we talk about discipleship as being a yes to God, a decision to follow Jesus, and that's where it starts. But I think as we grow, discipleship requires something more. It requires a long, honest look in the mirror from time to time, even as we, in Eugene Peterson's words, cultivate a long obedience in the same direction. So I think discipleship, in part at least, is the process of letting God show us those areas of our life that haven't caught up with our yes yet. Because we all have them. It's about finding finding the gap between our confession and our conduct. And Jonah lives that difference out for us in stark terms, and that's why we're going to spend the next couple of weeks in the book of Jonah. See, Jonah's more than just that classic Sunday school about the guy with the big fish. There's more going on there. According to scholars like Kevin Youngblood, Jonah is a didactic narrative. In other words, it's a story designed specifically to teach by holding up a mirror to the reader. It's a biting, sometimes funny, and deeply uncomfortable look at the term man of God, who says he fears the Lord, but lives like he doesn't. So what I'm suggesting is that if we want to grow as disciples this year, we have to be willing to look in the mirror of Jonah and ask, where am I saying yes with my mouth, but no with my life? Now, before we dive into Jonah's flight, I think we need to understand what kind of book we're reading. Jonah's unique among the prophets. In most prophetic books, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, things like that, we get pages and pages of God's words and only a few details about their life. Jonah's the opposite. We get about 5 words of prophecy in the whole book, but we get a detailed, almost satirical account of the prophet's behaviour. The conclusion is that the book was likely written for people trying to figure out their identity after national trauma. They were asking questions like, who are we? And what does it look like for us to live our role in the world? But maybe more importantly, they were asking questions like, who is God allowed to love? And how far does his mercy extend? See, The book is written as a parody of sorts. It challenges our categories about who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. The prophet is the one who turns out to be a rebel. The pagan is the one who turns out to be a seeker. And it's designed to catch religious people off guard. So that's why I think it's worth us doing. So we're going to read it as we go. I'll have parts of the passages up on the screen, and we'll just see what it's got to say to us. So this book starts this way. It says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So the word of the Lord comes to Jonah, "Arise, come, go to Nineveh." Nineveh is a messy place. It's the capital of the Assyrian Empire that was aggressive, and it was expansionist. It was a superpower known for its calculated cruelty. To Jonah, Nineveh would have represented everything wrong with the world. They were the terrorists. They were the threat. They were what's wrong with the world. And God says to him, "Arise." And Jonah rose. But then he ran in the opposite direction. He decides to run for Tarshish. And you can see, I've got a map up on the screen eventually. There we go. So Nineveh's up over on my right. He goes down to Joppa and then over to Tarshish, almost in the direct opposite direction. Scholar Phyllis Tribble, she points out that this fascinating literary pattern that we see in the first chapter of Jonah, every move Jonah makes is defined by the Hebrew word yarad. It means to go down. So he goes from Jerusalem down to Joppa on the coast. He goes down into the ship. He goes down into the hold of the ship to sleep. And then finally he goes down into the depths of the sea. Jonah's life becomes this geographical downward spiral that demonstrates his spiritual descent. That's part of what the author is showing us. And this is the first point, I reckon, that's worth sharing this morning. I think for most of us, we don't usually run from God by waving our arms around and stamping our feet and shouting no. We run from God by quietly slipping down. So I don't think most when God asks us to do something that we don't want to do, we don't throw a tanty. We don't crack it. But what we do is, I think our no to God is much quieter. We say yes with our lips and no with our life. And what we do is we run for a benign form of Tarshish, if you like. So for most of us, Tarshish isn't a city somewhere in Spain. It's the white noise of our suburban life. You think about how it is for you when you say no to God's nudges. God nudges you to reach out to that person you need to reconcile with, the family member who hurt you, the neighbour you've been avoiding, the colleague who needs to hear about Jesus. And you feel that sense of a rise in your spirit. But instead of saying no, you say yes, but later. And then you turn the telly on, or you reach for your phone, and you head down into the blue light of the scroll. You pay the fare of your attention to a streaming service or a social media feed. And for some of us, it's not an electronic device. For some of us, Tarshish might be retail therapy at Knox. Buying things we don't need to soothe the restlessness we don't want to name. It can be other stuff too. It's the busyness in our calendars where we fill our lives with sport and renovation and podcast and activities until our life becomes a noise-cancelling environment. Spurgeon talked about this. He talked about the idea that Jonah hasn't, on one level, Jonah hasn't done anything wrong. He's paid for his ticket. He's allowed to take his trip. But that doesn't mean he's being any less disobedient to the things that God is asking him to do. And it's the same for us. Walt Brueggemann calls this the royal consciousness. He talks about it in his book, The Prophetic Imagination. This prophetic consciousness is the mindset of the comfortable. It's the ability to maintain our own peace by ignoring the cries of the world. I was thinking about this a little bit yesterday. I took a run out to the airport because I was picking Mike and Adi up and I was looking to avoid work. And I was going along Alexandra Ave, the bottom of Fitzroy, and there are the guys out there, the homeless guys that offer to come and wash the windscreen for you, or just carrying cardboard signs, any spare change appreciated. Now, I was driving along, I was in a Tesla, that was an electric car, I had good music on, I had air conditioning flowing. It would have been so easy for me not to see these guys. But instead I was able to aim at them and run them over. No, the point being that we do this. We find ways to insulate ourselves from the world around us. We turn the music up. We look the other way. We choose not to see by focusing at something else. That's the royal consciousness that the prophets often challenge in us. For Jonah, when he got on his boat, he went down into the hull of the boat to sleep. He wasn't just tired. What he was doing was insulating himself from what he was doing, from what he was asked to do. He was technically present, but he had checked out. And I think for all of us, not just this church, but Christians all over the place, that's probably the most common no around us, isn't it? We aren't absent. We just check out. We're in the hold, staring at our phones while the word of the Lord is calling us to arise and love people that we'd rather ignore. And if this feels confronting, let me say this clearly. I'm not preaching about Jonah from a distance, and I'm not pointing fingers. I recognise this downward pull in myself. I know how easy it is to mistake rest for escape and comfort for faithfulness. See, I think that's the uncomfortable thing about Jonah's story. It's not about those people. It's about people like us, people like me. All right, so Jonah's on his boat and he's heading to Tarshish. Then we pick the story up in verse 4. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo in the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, he'd gone down, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come on, let's cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What's your country? And what people are you?" Jonah answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they said, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he'd already told them so. So Jonah is on his way to Tarshish. He's in his sleep, his benign sleep. And God sends this great wind. And then we see this stinging irony. The sailors, the ones who don't know God, they're the ones who are awake. They're praying. They're hurling cargo. They're doing the hard work of caring for the broader community on the ship, while the man of God is the only one not contributing. The captain finds Jonah and uses God's own word to him again. Arise. In other words, kum. Call on your God. This storm, I think, is what C.S. Lewis referred to as God's severe mercy. So you see, I think sometimes God has to rattle our fly screens a little bit with a storm to wake us up. And that's what's happening for Jonah. You know, it's those days when, I don't think we've had one so far this year, but the days are stinking hot. The north wind feels like it dries you out as you walk outside. And the day just feels like it's getting hotter and hotter. And then all of a sudden you see the clouds start to form on the horizon. And the storm comes and it drops about 10 degrees in the space of about 90 minutes. And you get the rain and the storm, and it's violent and it's disruptive and it is awesome. But that storm is the only thing that brings life back to the garden. And it feels like it's the only thing that's going to revive us sometimes. And I think the reality is sometimes that storm in our life, that might be God's cool change meant to wake us up before we start spiraling too far down into this benign Tarshish. All right, the story goes on. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," Jonah replied, "and it'll become calm. I know that it's my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they couldn't, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and they threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Now the Lord provided a large fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So the sailors say, what do we do? What do we do? How do we fix this? And Jonah says, "Just pick me up and hurl me into the sea." Now, this is often presented as Jonah being benevolent or being brave, sacrificing himself for the good of the others. But most Old Testament scholars now suggest that Jonah is not being noble here. He's being petulant. This is still part of his tanty. He's literally saying, "I would rather die than obey God." He chooses the abyss over his mission. But God is the God of scandalous mercy. And he co-opts Jonah's rebellion. He uses the storm to save the sailors, and then he appoints a great fish. This isn't a monster that God is using to torment Jonah. It's respite. It's a place where, if you want to update it, it's the place where the phone dies, where the noise stops, and the distractions are stripped away. I think there's a beautiful and there's a haunting irony here that Jonah went down into the sea to escape God's mission of mercy. But centuries later, one better than Jonah comes. Prophet turns up. Jesus said the only sign this generation would get is the sign of Jonah. But notice the difference. Jonah is thrown into the sea because of his own sin, because of his own stubbornness in his run from God. Jesus was thrown into the abyss because of our sin, because of our stubbornness. Jonah went down into the depths because he hated his enemies. Jesus went down into the depths of death because he loved his enemies, including you and I. So the thing is, if we want to stop our downward spiral, if we want to stop our run towards this benign Tarshish somewhere along the way, we don't find the power to do that by just trying harder, by sucking it up. We find it by looking to the one who took the ultimate downward spiral on our behalf. Because I think when you see how far God was willing to go down to find you, Nineveh, whatever that looks like for you, doesn't seem so scary anymore. So as we head into this week, I encourage you, have a look in the mirror and allow God to look in. And while you're looking, take a moment and ask yourself, where is my Tarshish? What everyday, maybe benign thing am I using to buffer myself about God's voice? Or using to buffer myself against God's voice? See, discipleship, it starts with a yes, but it grows as we interrupt the downward spiral of our quiet no's. The other thing I'd like to invite you to do this week is set a timer and sit in silence for 5 minutes. Notice what you feel when the noise stops. Notice who comes to mind. Notice where the restlessness is. Because that restlessness you feel, there's a good chance that's your wake-up call. That's where God is speaking. This book, this little book, challenges our categories. It tells us that the prophet can be the runner and the pagan can be the seeker. Jonah tells us that God's love stretches further than we can imagine and sometimes further than we are comfortable with. But don't go back into the hold. Don't pay the fare for another night of numbness. If there's a storm raging and the world is crying out and the God of mercy is calling, we need to heed the voice and arise. Amen.